Okay, so on week 5, we are doing the first half of the um, JavaScript Modern Bootcamp, the first half of arrays. So there's two concepts that are introduced generally together in most programming classes, and that is the idea of an array, a new data structure, a new what we call primitive in the language, and also a new technique for looping, or a new concept of looping. Like looping is the idea of going over, looking at each item and doing something with it. And it is a very common thing we see in programming in many ways. So what I like is that he talks about the traditional loop, the for loop, and then the for each loop in this discussion. So such great content here. So here's what I'm going to do for ours. And actually, let me just move back over just to talk about it in a minute. But just to give you the heads up, because I've been talking about it, your first dev is here. And by this point, because I'm recording early, is hopefully you've gotten used to, right? I will have given you a schedule for signing up and doing some other things. But what I decided to do this week on our Learn Together, besides the arrays and looping that I want you to implement for the stimulus, I also provided a copy of those requirements. And the reason I've done it this week is last week I had you think about and write about what you're going to do. This week, I want you to actually look at these requirements and ask questions. So the thing that I've also added here is, in addition to here's what your code needs to do, right? Here's the code review process. I've also given you a coding style guide. So this style guide is really just the idea of how I want you to use constants, lets for variable declaration. Okay, not to use var. As soon as I see someone using var, either they've learned the language in the past, or they're not understanding the requirements. So just don't do that. And then I say here on your function declaration, use arrow functions, but we actually do that after the first dev. So I've rewritten the function just to show you. Not all functions require return value, but they do, in my case, require a const, the function name, and then using the function keyword. Okay. And I do want you to format your code. That's one of the things VS Code is so good about. And I'll probably cover this concept, but the idea is in general, you can right click and hit format code or code selection. Use camel case for variable and function declaration. File name should always be lowercase, no spaces. And as we've seen already, I've converted us into using the index and the app.js, so you'll want to do that as well. Right? Most of your code needs to be inside of a function. Very little of your code should be setting out on the global namespace. And here is really the key. Don't use query or other libraries. And here is really what I want to say to you is write your own code, right? I can generally tell when somebody's, and part of it is when you write your own code, you have a better understanding. You can talk about it more. And also, I had hoped that by now I would have seen a few more of you in my office hours. So I'm wondering how I can encourage that. But also, hopefully maybe you have someone in your life that you can talk with about code. So anyway, I want you to, I'm going to rewrite this a little bit from the time you see it now until you actually have it looking at it. In that on the part 2, I want you to ask any questions, because really it's going over this, making sure you understand, some of the things like create meaningful output. So it has to have some kind of purpose. It can't just be randomly put together. Right? It needs to be different than what we've written already. Use comments to document your work. And here was the thing I talked about last time. Okay, so I'm going to let that stand on its own. Again, in your reply, I would prefer to see most of your writing focus on questions here. But if you want to talk about what you've done for the first part, you can do that. So now that we've done this, I want you to get experience with implementing arrays and loops into your stimulus. And I say your functions or method. Last time For week 4, I had you rewrite functions into methods. If you feel more comfortable going back to functions, that's totally okay. In your dev, I don't require you to do methods, although I think they're a good experience to get, and you'll see me using them today in my mileage example, right? But have at least 2 different ways you're using these concepts, right? So 2 different ways you're using arrays and 2 different ways you're using loops. And continue using this display on page, creating the index file, and providing a git hack link. Okay, so let me move over real quick into mine. So what I did is I continued on with the object method concept for my mileage. And I did modify my mileage at this point to declare when the program first starts as an empty array. And then in my calculate mileage method, I didn't change what I was passing in, but I did declare the MPG miles per gallon. And the why I did that is after my display, calling my display on page, and I rounded it here, is I pushed that into that empty array. So every time this runs, then it's pushing that in there. Now I'm going to walk you through how to write an average, because there's many different ways to write an average, but I'm going to show you it using just a standard for each. But you could absolutely do it with just a regular for, setting your initial, your conditional, and your incrementer, which is kind of, I almost consider that a little older style, using a for each when you can make sense, and you'll learn other ones going forward. But here's what I wanted to show you is before I even write that, if I come over here, I have this running right now. Down in the console, right, because this has, each of these have run now, right? I can just come down here and say track mileage dot mileage. And what that does is it shows me that I have 3 values, 3 MPGs, miles per gallon. And this is the line that does that. So it pushes it in there into the array. So each of those mileage calculations, MPG, gets pushed into an entry inside of the array. Okay, so understanding really importantly that in an array, the first position is 0, 1, and 2. Okay, so just know that that's the case. So I just want you to know that too, is, right, learning how to stop the code, walking through it, important too, understanding how you can use the console, because you can also, while you're in the middle of a function, also use the console.log to do that. So playing with these 2 techniques is important. But I'm going to move back over, because now what I really want to do is, in addition to calculating mileage, I want to calculate the average. What is the average mileage of all the processing of mileage I've done? And this is a fairly common thing. So I'm going to say let sum equals 0. Okay. I'm going to say this dot mileage, right, which refers to the empty array that's set up at the beginning, is going to now dot. So on this array, so this is only pointing to that array. And I'm going to say for each one of them. And this is the new term that you've learned at callback, right? So for each one, so it's going to look inside of that array, and for each one of them, it's going to run a function. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say, okay, I'm going to call that EL element. I could have called that miles per gallon for each MPG. That'd probably be a good one. It doesn't really matter what you name it. And what's good to do in the beginning is just console log it, or use your dev tools to see what is each of those, so you know you're grabbing them. Now, by the way, notice because I haven't used sum yet, it's actually a different color, and it's VS Code's way of trying to help you say, oh, you've declared a variable, but you haven't used it. So before we do any other calculation here, I'm going to flip over and I'll show you, and I'm just going to take off here and I'm going to refresh my page, is that here is the output, right? So what it did is it looped through. So I know I'm looping correctly. Okay, that's great. I know that I can see each entry that's in there. It tells me the line number that's creating this output on the console. At this point, I don't need this output here because really all I'm focused on is here are all the mileage entries I got for my processing. Okay. So I generally start this way. Again, you could set that breakpoint here and look at that as well. Okay, so but now again, I don't need this. Often a good step to do, but I could say sum, which is that variable, plus equal. So it's a shorthand way. Sorry, equal plus. I said it right and typed it wrong. So I'm saying take whatever is sum for the first time around at 0 and add to it what is ever the MPG. Okay. Now, to get average, I first need the sum of all those entries. Okay. So that's cool. I can do that. And now that I have that, I could console log sum to look at it to see if that works. That's another way again, or use your dev tools. But I can also just say return, and I can say sum divided by this dot mileage dot length. Because length is going to give me the number in the number of entries in the array. And I'm going to take the sum and divide that, and then I'm going to return this value. Okay, so this calculation gets done. And length, again, understanding that method here on the array, which will tell us how many entries are in there, will allow us to then use that to say sum divided by the number of entries, which we know is the average. Once that comes back here, then it'll output that. So let's come over here and we go, yeah, 50, that looks about right, about 50 miles per gallon for each of, well, looking at those mileage outputs. And so what I could also do here is there's a couple things since I'm doing this. I could do math.round. And I could say, okay, do that, but also when it comes back, or I could do it up there, right? If I round it, then I get 51 using those methods we learned about last week. Okay, so I just wanted to give you an example here so you could kind of get the feeling for this. Again, what I'm going to do, and this is the thing I'm going to leave you with here, is on my code that I'm going to produce for the example, I'm also going to cover the last of this, right? Because we're not going to have a learn together where we get to do some code related to these last items of filtering and sorting. But I'm also going to show you in my code example the idea of using last week's concepts, which are objects and arrays together, because that is a very common thing. Let me just preview to show you. And so as example, I could say, let. Now this is just, I'm not writing this code for this. I'm just saying entries equal, and I could set an array. And then inside of that array could be like my miles equals miles, right? And then I could do, oh, my keyboard just went out. That's unfortunate. Oh, there it goes. And then I could say, and actually there's a shorthand later. We could look at this. And so what I could do is create an array of objects. And this data structure is a very common one we see. And then I could say MPG is equal to MP. Ooh, oh, look at that. my mouse, my keyboard it's not low on battery, so I'm not sure what happened. So that's what I'm going to probably look on my example, on my code example for this week. So again, give yourself the time and the experience and the muscle building to use these skills in whatever way you walk away understanding it from the lecture. Okay, yours should look different. Each of ours should look different. There may be inspirations, and I've talked about this idea. And if you actually use somebody else's code to get started, or after you've tried, you do need to say that. And then your code does need to be different. And I've been saying this for a while, and I know this is a kind of a hard concept, but I'm just trying to give you that pause and that ability to use that muscle. Okay, this is it. I'll talk to you later.